Hello, welcome to Microsoft Certified Professional Developer 4.0 with ASP.NET and C#. The content exam focus is 70-515, and the content is owned and created by Ravi Nanganuri, Microsoft MVP.NET Videos.net. So this is video number 13 in our series, ASP.NET 4.0 Membership and Security is what we're going to cover here. A few keywords you need to know. Authentication is determining the identity of your users and either authenticating them or denying them authentication rights. Authorization, slightly different. The user's already been authenticated and we want to control access or maybe give them or deny them access to certain parts of the application, perhaps depending on what role they are in. Are they an administrator? Are they in some other role, depending on who their user is, as an example. There are several built-in mechanisms, as we're going to look at with ASP.NET 4.0, that handle this. First of all, there's many controls you can use. So if you need things like being able to create users, login controls, change passwords, password recovery, all this stuff built in already for you, and these controls are extensible, and they are a piece of boilerplate code, if you will, that you can extend. So it's a great way, out of the box, they're functional controls, but you may want to extend the functionality or tweak them. You can certainly do that here. And you can protect parts of your application with the authorization element. So getting back up to authorization for a moment in the web config. As we'll see, the web config kind of configures and drives this. So the idea to take away and remember is you don't need to build or hard code this stuff into your applications directly. This needs to be a configurable thing, and we're going to show how that's done with ASP.NET. Now the first thing we're going to use is the ASP.NET management service, basically, that handles all this. What I'm going to have to do is launch a Visual Studio 2010 command prompt. I'm going to run it as an administrator, so elevated privileges here. And I'm going to run a command utility called ASP.NET_RegSQL. And that command is going to set up a database store for me to manage my users, manage my membership information. So again, this is something that's built in for you. You need to set it up the first time. If you don't choose to set this up, you would be using SQL Express just kind of by default, and I don't want to do that. So this is going to launch a wizard. I'll go ahead and click Next, and I'm going to configure SQL for application services. And again, this is going to basically set up against an existing database, my membership profile, role management, all that stuff can live in this SQL server. I'll use my local SQL server here, and just basis on the default database, you'll see that it's going to create us a new database name in a moment, and I'll use Windows Auth here as just the authentication to get this done, to get this set up. You'll see how we'll actually change this or change later on to a different authentication method for our application itself. But you notice here it's just a server name. It's a very simple wizard walkthrough here. And again, you basically had an existing database, SQL Server, something more robust than SQL Express for a production environment. I want to set this up the first time. It's just a click finish. So ASP.NET_RegSQL will successfully create that database for me. If I come out here to SQL Server 2008 and I was actually looking inside the local instance here via SQL Management Studio, as we'll see, I've got, and just connect to the database, I'll have database engine, I'll have my ASP.NET DB database created there for me. And it's got various tables here for memberships, roles, users, etc. And as we create users and manage roles and passwords and everything else, it's going to be stored in this database, this backend data store for me. So I may want to do this in situations where I have applications I want to expose over the internet and I want to end up using forms authentication. Could certainly use Windows authentication for most of my intranet scenarios or my internal network scenarios. You notice here that the web config is going to need some modifications the first time to point to this new data store for our authentication stuff. So there's a couple of things we want to do. We're going to leverage a combination of this web config and what's called the ASP.NET configuration tool. So if I'm using an ASP.NET web application project, I would go to Project, ASP.NET configuration. I've got this ASP.NET website administration tool. Now this is actually changing the web config for me in the background. I could do much of the stuff here in the wizard, and I could select authentication type. I'm currently set to Windows at this point. You can walk through the security wizard kind of end to end to get set up. So for your security stuff, you certainly could be on this wizard tool here, and it's basically touching web config for us, setting up a bunch of settings. Now I'm going to recommend that what you do is, and you see here that I've got the access method here, so we're going to take an example of when we're going to have to expose this over the web. So move into like a forms based model versus just using like built-in Windows authentication. And we can walk through this tool. We'll get to the point here where we're going to be asked for a provider setting. And at this point, we're still using the default stuff. So we'd still be pointing to SQL Server Express. We've not wired up the stuff that we did in our first step when we created the new data store. We've not wired that in yet here to the application. So we need to do that. So the first thing you're going to have to do is actually come into the web config itself. And you notice there it changed this already for me, the web config to forms authentication. There's a bit of setup you need to do in the web config before I can jump back over into this web application in your website administration tool. If I come into provider configuration here, you'll notice when I say I want to select a provider for the actual web application, and it's just I just have this one, and I can test this. This is just the provider that's pointing to the SQL Server Express database at this point. I don't have any other options here for that custom store I created. So you have to touch web config one time, the first time, to make this happen, and then from that point on you can be in here doing a lot of the configuration. See, I can be creating users here through the site administration tool, managing that stuff through this web tool. We're going to go over to the web config in a moment. Just to drive this point home, I'll go ahead and create a user. So currently I'm using the website administration tool. We'll show in a bit how you can use the controls to actually create users on your web application via the web app. They wouldn't be in this tool. You see, it's created successfully completed, and then I come back in here and I'm going to test the provider management stuff. All looks like it's working fine. Everything looks like it's working fine, and it is. But the problem is, again, I'm not pointing to my custom data store. I'm pointing over here to SQL Express. So if I come in my custom data store, if I drilled into the data, this ASP.NET DB we created earlier, and I run look at data, there won't be anything created over there. If I actually went over and looked at on my screen for the actual SQL Server Express database, I can connect to it via Server Explorer over here, and I look in the membership table. I'm actually creating users out here in the membership table for SQL Express, and this is not what I want at this point. I want to point to my new custom data store that lives on a real SQL Server database, not SQL Server Express, because I'm in an enterprise environment and I want to take advantage of pointing to my custom store that we set up with the ASP.NET Reg SQL command. So what we could do, I'm going to go ahead and fast forward a bit and paste some information here, but I've pasted some membership information into the web config that makes this possible. And it's basically a connection string. You see up here, I've got initial catalog equals ASP.NET DB, and I've got this connection strings element that should be familiar to you. It's up here in the web config file. And I've got this, I'm just pointing to that via the membership, and the providers element here is very important. The providers element is where you plug that connection string in, and I've got my default provider there. So from now on, when I run this configuration tool again, I'll have the option to go into provider configuration, and I can select a different provider for each feature, which says it's advanced. And you see right now, if I just come in here and I select a single provider, it's that ASP.NET provider. I want to use this more advanced option down here, and it says membership provider .NET videos membership provider. I can go back and forth here to the default built-in one, which is again that SQL Express one, or this one here I created that points to our real data store. So it's web config changes. I click OK. I test that provider. It works. And this data provider stuff's all set up at this point. If I look at the security, notice I have no users now that exist. Now when I'm creating users here and I'm doing the management work, I'm walking through the various wizards that are available to me here, I'm pointing to our custom data store, that ASP.NET DB. And to kind of walk this or prove this out, I'll go ahead and create Ravi again here. Just enter a secret question, security answer here. And I will hit create user, and it says created successfully. And if we'd go and actually look now at the SQL Server data that we created earlier, and we ran this SQL query again, you see I do have data now in the actual table itself, so I know I'm pointed to the correct store, the correct data store from that point on. And that's great, because now I have the benefits of, I can always come in and wire everything up manually in the web config, and you notice I don't have to use this SQL Express DB anymore, but I can also come to the website administration tool and do various things, whether it's create and manage new roles, whether it's create application settings, come in here and work with security, create users, even manage users from here. Again, this won't your end users won't be using this, but you can certainly use it during development. If I go back through my wizard here for the security wizard, the kind of the end-to-end security wizard, And you notice I'm going to go ahead and move on. I could be defining new roles here and giving people certain access. And this is basically making web config entries for me graphically through a GUI. And I could do all this stuff in the manual way. Like if we created a role and I wanted to basically lock down certain parts of my application, we could do that from here. But the idea is you can use a combination of the manual web config entries, which you should understand, of course, as well as this GUI tool that's our helper now that we've set this up in kind of the first time. I'm going to go ahead and show kind of more from the web application experience. If I right click, I've got two web forms right now, a login and a register form. And you notice under your login in your toolbox, you've got various controls here that we can use. So for example, if I got a register users page where I want them to basically be able to register on my web app, which is very common, right, where they want to basically be able to create a new user that can log in. You've got this create user control here that's built in, and it's functional right out of the box. It's based on all these various tags here give you more flexibility. You could plug in programmatically into this thing. It's extensible as well. But just out of the box, I've got a create user wizard. I can just put it on a web form. And if I've got a login form somewhere, I've got a login control. So this control-based stuff, it's basically decoupled from that functionality where we're pointing to that provider stuff. I'll go ahead and drag and drop a login control. I've got a duplicate name here. I'll fix that up real quick, and I've got a login control with what you expect, username and password. And there's built-in functionality that's configurable, like how strong we need to be the password. Do I want the password to be showing? Do I need to confirm password box? All this kind of stuff kind of handled for you. Remember me next time, a very common scenario for login controls. So the idea is if we just ran this right now, we could actually, which I'll go ahead and do. You can see on my web form here, I'm going to go ahead and just put in a new test user. And I've exposed some functionality to allow users now, just very quickly, very easily, no code at all I've wrote at this point. And they basically can register themselves on our web application, which again is going to stick data off into the SQL data store that we had configured earlier. So I've got this new, I go ahead and hit continue, and it completes. And if we actually would go and look at the data store that we had configured a moment ago, you would now see this new user is in play. And notice if I look at the code behind for the actual web application, we've not written a bit of code to make this happen at this point. We execute and look at the data on the SQL side. This new user is here. So we're basically using the provider, and then we're using these built-in controls to make the functionality easy for the development and handling all this for your application on the security side. Same thing with the login control. You could certainly come in and they could log into users. One of the common things you're going to want to do is, if users are not authenticated, redirect them to a login page. So what we have is we go into the web config, and we've got the web authentication as forms. And what I can do is I can certainly set a forms tag here with a login URL, and this is just going to be login.aspx, wherever I want the users who are not authenticated to be bounced over to. And what we're going to say is, if you would try to hit one of our pages without logging in, bounce us over to the login page automatically. We don't want to allow that. We want to make sure everybody's authenticated in this scenario. We also add a deny users equals question mark in the authorization tab there, just saying, hey, any users, we're going to deny you unless you've been authenticated. So what we can do is we go ahead and rerun this application, and I've started on the register page, but it immediately bounced me over to login. You notice over here we've got this return URL equals register, and that's what's going to happen when somebody authenticates successfully. It's going to bounce them back over to the actual login page. So what we can do is, if I try to type register.aspx in the URL directly here, it's not going to let me do that. It's going to say, no, you need to log in. You need to be authenticated before we can allow you access to the application. So at this point, I'll type in a good user, Ravi, and then the actual real password there. And at this point, I am authenticated. I am over on the register page, etc. So this would be for all your pages on your application. You could set this where only certain pages need to be protected. There's lots of flexibility here. And then once again, if you go into the ASP.NET configuration tool, there's one final item I want to point out, and that's the fact that the idea of roles. You could be driving some of this with roles, and you can enable that via this tool, which again will make web config setting entries for you. But if you come into the actual wizard itself and go all the way down, it's very simple to define some roles. So maybe you have a role called super user or a super administrator or something like this, where you're going to have everybody else is not going to have access to a part of the application except for this role. Maybe you've got you're driving everything with roles. You can imagine lots of scenarios with that, and you can manage your users here. And then eventually, when you come down, you could select directories where only certain roles had access, or you can deny them access. So very straightforward, very easy to do. And again, a combination of being in this configuration tool on the GUI side and then being back over in the web config tool to make all this happen very easily for you. It's not something where you're going to be writing hard-coded custom code to manage membership or manage security anymore.